The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Glory to you, O Lord. On that day, Jesus went out of the house and sat down by the sea. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat down, and the whole crowd stood along the shore. And he spoke to them at length in parables, saying, A sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seed fell on the path, and birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky ground, where it had little soil. It sprang up at once, because the soil was not deep. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and it withered for lack of roots. Some seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it. But some seed fell on rich soil, and produced fruit 100 or 60 or 30-fold. Whoever has ears ought to hear. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
The Gospel of Matthew has, as a feature, 5 main teaching blocks of Jesus, and this is the third and central teaching block, and it's a chapter of parables. So we begin that today. I think that in and of itself is remarkable. It's certainly notable. Just we have to get our orientation. This is quite literally, right, the central feature of Matthew's gospel, and the teaching it's then a bit I would say it's a bit strange, because of course parables, although they give voice to what Jesus is doing, and they invite Jesus's hearers into what he's doing, they're also it's not straightforward teaching in the way that we would think he would do it. Certainly, if we were him, we might do it. We might think that we would do it a little bit differently. But he is bringing to life God's loving rule, and he is advancing it. And he is then, and part of that advancing it is to invite people into it, and that itself is not a straightforward proposition. Because it matters not only that the people are giving themselves over to God's rule, but that they understand, at least in part, at least as they're able to grasp what it looks like as it's unfolding, so that they can find their place in God's plan. The challenge with this particular parable that the people will have heard or faced is that they understand kind of like the setup of the scene of the sowing of seed. After some time of, I don't know, say either God's anger with his rebellious people, the promise was that he would re-sow or replant Israel. And the people around Jesus are waiting for that day. So they're waiting for the coming kingdom of God. It's just they imagine it they imagine that it will come about in a particular way. And what Jesus does here in this parable is say, it's not going to happen in the way that you expect it to. There's 2 parts, rather. One is, it is happening now. Right? So Jesus, being God's anointed king, is the one who is going to usher in God's kingdom. Yes, it is happening now, but it is not happening in the way that you expect it to. I could end the homily there, I know, see if you're lucky today. I could end the homily there and just say, the kingdom of God does not come about in the way that they expect, but likely in the minds of most of us, or most all of us, or maybe even all of us, the kingdom of God is not going to come about in the way that we expect. We have to push into that a little bit, right? And say, well, what are our expectations for the coming kingdom of God? How is God's kingdom going to come? And I think we have some sense, okay, look, the God's kingdom can be, I don't know, how do we say? I don't want to do it because the language around it is very technical, and I'm going to get it wrong, is the challenge, right? The church is an embodiment of the kingdom of God, chiefly because we have the king at the center of the entire operation. But then it becomes somewhat conditional, right? It's like, if Jesus is at the center of the entire operation, then we have the kingdom. The church embodies this through this particular age, I should say. Through the generations, the church is living this kingdom of God reality and is an advanced foretaste of the full implementation of the kingdom of God that occurs when Jesus returns. So we have to be not just the advanced sign, but we're also bringing about the reality. What happens is that just as it happens to Jesus' contemporaries, we get any number of agendas in our head, even agendas that we conflate with the church as kingdom of God reality. And then we start to drive those agendas, or we start to think, if only this were to happen or this were to happen, then we would be in that place. The kingdom of God would have come, or the world would be a better place. It's like that kind of language, right? What I'm going to say is this. When Jesus says, whoever has ears ought to hear, he's already setting the stage for this to be a place where people have to think very hard about what he's saying, and he wants them to do that. It's not simply that he's going to roll out a whole list of answers or even propositions that you can assent to or agree with, and once you have that all, then everything's fine. No, he wants you to puzzle over. He wants his congregation, his audience, his crowd to puzzle over what he's saying, in part because it has to go down deep. And if we're not thinking about these things, if we're not puzzling over them, then it's not going to go down deep. It just remains a very superficial reality. So we have to think with all the strength that we have, with all the energy and attention that we have to really consider what Jesus is doing. But I'll say the other part of what's going on in the parable that and Jesus is addressing the crowd that is of, say, utmost significance, is that it all centers around him. Yeah, so, I don't know. I said a lot of things that could be potentially confusing or difficult to understand already this morning. But I'll say something that isn't that hard to understand, and is that Jesus has to be at the very center of your heart and your life. He has to be. And thankfully, that's not a great. It is a great task for us because it has to be worked out. It has to be thought about very deeply. We have to consider all, what is his agenda? What does it look like? How do I live it? How do I find my place in it? And all that kind of thing. But it's also very simple and straightforward because he gives himself to us. Right? We have the scriptures, we have the New Testament. It's not as though we have no signposts and no guardrails. We have the teachings of the church. We have the lives of the saints. Right? I mean, when you talk about expectations, right? Where in our expectations of quote unquote the world becoming a better place does martyrdom factor into it? Where does it factor in? Where does martyrdom factor into it? Where do faithful people, and I would say the most faithful people, where do faithful people dying for Jesus factor into the world becoming a better place? I'm just saying our expectations have to be oftentimes turned on their head. But there, what we see is faithfulness above all. Friendship with Jesus above all, right? There's the martyrs refuse to give up Jesus, and they will live out authentically, say everything that comes in wake of their commitment to Him, which means any number of things, right? But we ourselves have to turn our hearts and our lives over to Jesus again and dedicate ourselves this morning, as we do every morning, to following him wherever he leads. And if he leads us into martyrdom, then so be it. That's where he's leading. And if he leads us there, then he'll give us the strength to persevere there. But that's our task, is to be faithful. And that is the success of a Christian, right? We have to be faithful above all. We have to be dedicated to his kingdom and his kingdom work and the rest. And we've got to be willing to go where he sends us. Now, of course, there are ways to work these things out in practical detail. And I would encourage you to do so. Why? Because you've been called to it. Whoever has ears ought to hear. I should end. So, like whoever has ears. We have to do it. We have to give ourselves over to the task. And again, he has not only called us to the task, he is here equipping us for the task, and he's sending us to do it. To bring to be about the work of God's kingdom coming on earth as it is in heaven. To live in and by the power of the Spirit, God's own life of love, renewing us and making us fit to restore his entire world.